Hello everyone and welcome back to Intro to Quixel Mixer. I'm Tyler, and in this video we are going to cover some of the basics to creating a pattern material inside Mixer. More specifically, we are going to create this material, which is a material of CMU, or Concrete Masonry Unit, which is a casted block that is used primarily for structural wall, foundations, or thermal masses, even accent walls in architectural works. Let's go ahead and begin creating a pristine version of the CMU. We're going to create a new mix here. We're going to label it CMU 2K and the metallic roughness workflow. And we have our 2 meter by 2 meter plane here, which is really important because we have to get our pattern to scale since this is a very specific item. So the first thing I want to do is go ahead and just add a solid layer. This base layer is needed to support the foundation of our pattern layer to give it a little depth later on. So now that we've added that, I'm just going to go ahead and quickly change this to something like 7.2, 7.2, and 7.2, this hex value. We aren't going to do anything else to this layer, really. It's really just to provide the next layer some information to work off of with its blending threshold. Now let's go ahead and create our pattern. So go ahead and add another solid layer. And so that we can have some contrast, I'm going to change the albedo to something a little darker. There we go, that should do it. Let's quickly just rename this to base pattern. That way we can organize our layer stack. Now in order to add the pattern, we have to go down and add a mask first. We select the mask, add a mask component, and then right down here under pattern, we're going to select square. And immediately you can go ahead and see this 4x4 tiled grid here, which is represented by the 4x4 repeat of the X and Y values here. So even if we set this to something like 1, we can make just basically one tile if we want, or 2x2 or 4x4. We can even do 13x18, or the repetition is endless. So if we set this back, let's just do 5x5. Now the spacing X and Y value here is all to do with the spacing in between the tile patterns. So if we zoom in here, let's increase this just a tad, and you see the X values across the X plane this way are increasing their thickness. And we can shrink the Y values in this direction by shrinking the Y values or increasing the Y values. Let's go ahead and set these back to just 1. Now to represent this offset here, I'm going to just go ahead and do something like 3x5. Now this offset here is just going to reposition the tile pattern in this horizontal location. We could convert this to a vertical pattern, and we can offset the tile pattern as you see in the viewport vertically. We're going to stick with the horizontal pattern in this episode, and we're going to make sure our offset is set to exactly 0.5, because then that means the grout lines here, as you can see, are perfectly in the center of each tile. And this next value, the jitter intensity, is talking about some of these tiles we could bring up in height or drop in height. So let's go ahead and increase this slider. Let's increase it all the way to 1. So you see some of these tile placements at random are at different height values. And that's to assume that of user error in placing the blocks or tile or stone paths or whatever you're creating. It's to provide some variation into the pattern of different height levels. So, and if we can adjust that jitter amount by the jitter amount, obviously. So if we don't want any of the tiles to jitter, we could just set it to 0, and this intensity doesn't really matter. But the higher we increase this, the more variation there is for all the tiles to be completely different. The threshold is how wide of the spectrum we are to cover with the height values, or the height map that's being generated by this jitter amount threshold, so to speak. So if we increase this, we can almost see some of the tiles disappear and some of them come back. Let's go ahead and set this to 0.5-ish range. And the random seed obviously is to randomize all of these effects together. Let's just set these back down to nothing. And the bevel is going to add a little beveled edge right at the cracks. And we can adjust the curve, or how sharp that is. So, and if we bring this up, we can tighten that curve effect or the curve shape. Or if we bring the bevel all the way up and lower the bevel curve, it becomes almost like a star pattern. So there are some variations that you could play with and play around with different ideas of what you could produce giving some tiles. Like if you were going to do tiles on a floor, usually the corners can be slightly beveled depending on the tile. Or if you're going to do some really stones, you could rough up the edges of all this tile pattern and have different beveled effects depending on what you're after. There's a lot that you can achieve with just these bottom properties. But for the sake of this tutorial, we're just going to keep both the bevel and bevel curve to 0 because we're not really going to use them at all. Now that we've quickly covered the settings, let's go ahead and set up the actual shape to the CMU. So the nominal size to CMU is referred to as 8 by 16 inches, or for the metric scale, it's 20.32 by 40.64 centimeters. However, in reality, the actual size of CMU when it comes out of its finished cast is 7 5/8 inches by 15 5/8 inches, or 19.37 centimeters by 39.69 centimeters. The reason the actual size is the way it is due to the construction methods to ensure a uniform building construction. There is a typical grout line that measures 3/8 of an inch, or 0.9525 centimeters, in CMU wall, as well as you see in bricks. So we use the 8 by 16 inch terminology for sizing wall heights accurately with the common knowledge of the size needed for a bead of grout in between all of the blocks. Since the nominal dimensions of an 8 by 16 inch CMU measure to exactly the center of the grout lines, we will use this in our calculation for uniformity. So for Quixel mixers use, we're going to be using 20.32 centimeters by 40.64 centimeters in our calculations. The best results I've found is basing it off of the 2 meter by 2 meter plane that you see that we have here. So there are 200 centimeters in 2 meters. So 200 centimeters divided by 40.64 centimeters for one horizontal block is 4.92 blocks wide on this plane. Let's round this up to 5 since Quixel Mixer doesn't allow decimals in this location yet. So on this repeat X, we have 5 here for this value. And in this repeat Y value, we have a vertical measurement of 200 centimeters divided by 20.32 centimeters. That accounts for 9.8 blocks high in the Y value. We're going to also round this up to 10 since we can't add a decimal place. And for a 2 by 2 meter, this comes out to as close to on scale without being to scale that we could figure out. So right now in the viewport, we have the general number that we're going to be using for our CMU blocks. But let's go ahead and adjust our grout lines because right now they're way too thick. So as I said, grout is 3/8 of an inch, or 0.9525 in centimeters. Since our tile pattern is to the center of the grout, we need to split this 0.9525 in half, making it 0.4763 centimeters. This is the value that we could use for our spacing. Fortunately, we could use decimals here. So for our spacing X and Y values, we need to make sure that we have 0.476 in both categories. And you can see this is starting to look much better. Let's turn off our 3D view here and just zoom in. Now this spacing is looking to be way more realistic and more to scale without actually being 100% to scale. It's more like 98% to scale. And when masons lay CMU, they usually have measuring tools to make sure it's all perfect. So the likelihood of CMU being a little bit different in the height values here, when I'm referring to this jitter intensity and jitter amount, it's going to be so marginal that it wouldn't be recognizable to the naked eye. But to play along with realism, we're just going to set this jitter intensity to something really small, like 0.139 area. As well as the jitter amount, we're just going to go ahead and set to 1. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to see any sort of a difference. From this, I can barely see a little bit of a difference right here, here, here. I mean, it's extremely subtle, but it helps sell a more realistic look. And I'm not going to worry about the threshold. I'm just going to keep it at this default value of 0. And the last thing I want to do here is go ahead and add a subtle blur effect to the edges of the pattern here. And the reason for that is so that it's not too sharp, but there's a nice gradient whenever we increase the threshold of this layer. So let's go ahead and add a mask modifier. Go down to blur and Gaussian blur. It's too blurry, but let's take the strength value and go ahead and just type in an extremely low value. So 0.009 turned out to be somewhat okay for me. So you can see when we zoom in, that edge is extremely blurry. Let's go ahead and turn this off, turn it back on. So that way it adds a little bit of smoothness to the edges of our CMU blocking, like it would almost be in realism. Now that we have our pattern shape, let's go ahead and click on the main layer and increase our threshold to something like 0.2 so that we can actually see some depth to our layer. If this looks pretty blocky like this, don't worry. Let's just go ahead and go up to display. And I'm going to turn up my tessellation to 5 for now. And then it's going to re-represent everything you can see in a more fine-tuned level. Now we have our CMU shape and we have our grout line thickness, but we don't actually have any grout showing on our image. So the next layer I want to do is work on the actual grout texture itself. Now there are 2 ways that we can go about this, or at least 2 ways I'm going to show you right now. So the first way we're going to do is we're going to add a solid layer with a perlin noise mask. So let's go ahead and just right up here, add a solid layer. And then I want to bring this solid layer below the base pattern for this example. We're going to go ahead and rename this to Grout A. And let's go ahead and, for some better contrast, let's change this albedo to this grout to all 6s. Hit apply. And I'm going to just raise my threshold to something like 0.35 so we can bring that up. But yes, it disappeared, but our radius we're going to set to 0. And our preserved details we're going to set to 10. Then we're going to come down here and we're going to add our mask, just like before. Make sure our mask is selected. Then I'm going to go up here to add a mask component, select noise, and I'm going to go down here and select perlin noise. And you can see already we've got some interesting shapes going on, but we need to take this perlin noise and we need to make it more granular like grout would be. So this first value here we're going to change is the amplitude. Now amplitude represents the large details or the size of the perlin noise in general. So we're going to change this to something really small because we need the amplitude to be really small and we need the frequency to be really high. So frequency changes the wavelength of the amplitude noise, so we need it to be a very high frequency so the detail is packed together tightly. So we're just going to take this frequency slider and crank it all the way to 20. The next slider we're going to change the octaves to be about 9, that should say. And if we zoom in, we can already start seeing the grout to appear. So the octave is basically the levels of detail generated by the perlin noise. So the higher number of octaves means the more times that the seed, amplitude, and frequency is regenerated at different levels of resolution, so to speak. Basically, the higher the number octave, the more detail it is and more granular it is, and the lower the level, the wider the detail is. And then we're going to set the lacunarity to something around 3.3. And what this is, it's generally referred to as the spacing between the octaves. So how often do the octaves affect the perlin noise as a whole? And then we're going to change the persistence to something like 0.0887. And what the persistence is basically the amplitude of the octaves. So we're going to be covering, like I said, the noise settings more in depth later on in their own special video. But for now, these are some of the settings that I got to get the effect. As you can see right here in these grout lines, it's already starting to look like grout. These are some of the settings that I use, so you're more than welcome to use or play around as you see fit. So this is a good start to getting a grout line based just off of a solid layer and procedural noise. And we can even go in and change this color to be, whatever we want. It doesn't really matter. But what I want to do is show you the other method to creating grout, and that's already using a texture straight from Megascans, and we're going to mix it together. So for now, we're going to hide this grout layer. So I'm going to make sure my top layer is selected, and I'm going to add a surface layer. And then I'm going to choose wet cement. Now, wet cement is not a free texture from what I understand. So if we go to the online, you could probably use the cracked asphalt texture here. It's very similar. It's a little bit different, and it should give you a similar result if you're trying to follow from this free version. But I found the wet cement texture here produced the best results to what I'm after. So once we have the wet cement brought in, I'm just going to go ahead and rename this to Grout B so we can be organized. And then what I'm going to do is ensure that it's set to from below because we want this texture to pop up underneath the pattern. So I need to increase the threshold a little bit to bring up my cement or my new grout through my texture pattern. So let's set this to something like 0.25. And as you can see, it's already brought this in pretty close. I'm going to set my radius to something also pretty low because I need this pattern to be really tight, but I also want some slight blending effects. I want my preserved detail to be all the way to the max because I want all the detail from the grout to pop out. And then I'm going to need the opacity to be ever so slight so that we can have some of the CMU base pattern affect a little bit of the shape of the grout. So we're going to change this to something around 0.883. There we go. And it lightened it up a little bit, but let's go ahead and just change our albedo to something that's not green. And let's also change this to all 6s like we did to the previous grout. There we go. And you can see already that even this grout with the settings that I have has even popped up through the CMU here in the middle a little bit. That's okay because we're already starting to establish the general shape of the pattern. If you don't want this grout texture to be placed on top of this at all, what you would have to do is take this base pattern, right click it, you would copy this mask stack, then you would right click on this layer and then you would paste new mask. So that will basically take this pattern stack here and double it here on the grout B. And then what you would want to do is take this pattern and invert it and change some settings that only the grout lines are showing. That's another way that you can go about this. But for me, I want this cement texture to kind of pop up through the CMU a little bit so we can add some extra depth. So now that we have our grout the way we want, let's go ahead and add the textures for our CMU itself. So what I'm going to do here is also use Megascans Library, and I'm going to go up here and add surface layer. And this time I'm going to choose rough concrete, which I believe is a free sample as well. Yes, rough concrete right here. So I'm going to go ahead and select rough concrete and let those textures load in. Great, now that we have that in, let's go ahead and just rename this to CMU text 1. And now that we have that, we need this layer to come from above because we want this texture to kind of stamp the top of the CMU. So we're going to select our blend mode to be from above. And don't worry, it's pretty wild. Let's go ahead and change our color to our albedo. I'm going to change it to 2D, 2D, 2D. Very gray tones here. So now that we need to lower this texture into our pattern, so we need to lower the threshold. I've used -0.29. And you can see it's already created a pretty nice stamp of our texture. I'm going to change my radius to something really small, like 0.095, I believe I have. And the reason why I do that is so that it can tighten up the blending mode there, since we're only wanting to really affect the tops of the CMU. And then I'm going to make sure that my preserve detail is set to 0. And that also helped preserve some of the grout lines below. So as you can see, most of the CMU texture that we've had is stamped on just the CMU. You could also do this with the mask, but I've found it works this way too if you do the thresholds and radiuses just right. I'm going to make sure my opacity is set to 1. We're going to also wrap to base, but just about halfway, so 0.531. And I'm going to make sure my remove base details is really set to 1. You could really do a 0 too. Let's just go ahead and do 0. And for this texture is a little bit too big, so I'm going to tile it by 2. And as you can see, it's starting to look a lot like CMU, even at the state that it's at. We have our grout line. The blending between the grout and the CMU is looking pretty good, and the texture is looking pretty sound. But I'm going to add another texture variation to our CMU because the more variations you have in texturing certain elements provides even more realism to the effect that you're trying to sell. So we're going to add another CMU texture here, more specifically another Megascans texture. I don't believe this one is free, but I'm going to be using the Asphalt Fine. And now that that's in, I'm going to rename this to CMU Text 2 so we can be organized again. And I'm going to also make sure this is blending from above. Going to change my albedo to something a little different than before, just to add a tad bit of variation. So we're going to do 494949. Hit apply. And as before, we need to bring this threshold down so it stamps into our texture. So -0.265 seemed to work out pretty well for me. There you go. And you could do this, but I think the radius ought to be lowered as well. So 0.053 is what I'm using. And preserve details, we're going to actually increase this just a tad because we want a lot of the details from this particular texture to be preserved, but we don't want the effect to be super strong. So we're going to set the opacity to something like 0.394. So as you can see, it's a very subtle effect right here in these few areas. We're going to wrap to base to something a little bit higher, so 0.863. So it really grabs the shape of the pattern that we have there. But I don't want to remove any of the base details again. So drop that back down to 0. And then next, I want to make sure that the height values of this particular texture, since it has some pretty drastic jumps in it, because we're trying to make more of a smooth CMU, I'm going to increase the high frequency a little bit so that it tightens up those height values. So I'm going to do 1.41, just a little bit, and to increase a little bit of the texture, let's tile this by 3. So 3 by 3. And you can see we have our perfectly raw, clean CMU block texture. But say this finished clean wall needs to be painted. And usually you would paint a CMU wall if it's going to be, if the CMU pattern is going to be finished, like in a school or a restaurant, or even if your house. If you like that CMU pattern, but you need it to be painted for whatever reason, how do you go about making paint in this? Well, there's a couple different methods. The first method is to just go ahead and add a solid layer. And we're going to set this solid layer to blend from above. And then what we're going to do is make sure this wrap to base, like we've done before, is set all the way to 1. So the color of this solid literally snaps to every part of the geometry of the patterns that have been set by all the layer stacks below. Let's go ahead and just paint this albedo to something a little bit hotter. Maybe a little bit of a dark orangey red color. There we go. And if we zoom out here, we've gone ahead and we've painted that CMU, easy as pie. But this paint represents, as you can see, there's not really much of any type of reflection or anything. So this is more of a matte finish. And also that the finish here is very fine grained. So it's more like they've painted this with a spray nozzle. So say they didn't want to use a matte finish. Let's go ahead and increase our gloss a tad. Something pretty high. Let's go ahead and move our light around. Oh, there we go. That's a little too glossy, I think, for paint. And you could probably find the actual glossy paint values out there somewhere. There we go. We've added some sheen to our paint color. But say if this paint wasn't done by a spray nozzle, say if it was rolled on, like it was wet applied thick paint. So how do we go about making sure that some of the detail below is removed or blurred together to make it look like the paint has a thickness to it? Well, you could just easily just remove the base details. Let's set it to something like 3. Now, this looks blurry, but when you think about the thick paint that could be applied, it's going to apply a really smooth effect to it. I mean, whenever you're this far out, you can't really tell so much of the fine details below because it's going to be like that in real life, especially if it's wet applied paint. You can also achieve this by utilizing the liquid layer here. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm just going to hide this layer, and then I'm going to add the liquid layer. Now we don't see any liquid here, but that's because our threshold, it's also like the threshold of all the other layers. So we need to raise this from the bottom, and liquid will normally always be done from the bottom. So let's go ahead and increase our threshold to something really slight. You may have to mess with this depending on what your height is to your plane. But through trial and error, I figured out that 0.24 gets to be the sheen that I'm after. If you increase it too much, well, you'll just get water. Or if you slightly lower it, you can see the water is being applied. Or if it's a stone path, you can add water to a block path there. But 0.24 is the values that we're going to use here. That way you don't see any actual water, but you're getting the glistening effect that this layer is providing across the entire texture. But like the solid layer that I did before, all this detail below is showing up through the fake paint that we have right now. So how do we get that if we don't have a remove base detail option? Well, under this moist category, we have the blur option. So let's go ahead and turn this up to something like 3. So now it's blurred the effect, and you can do it even more and more to give the effect that you want. But I think for paint, to get that slightly thickened paint that we had before, a blur level of 3 seems to do the trick just well. Then also this darken effect, we don't want the liquid to darken the albedo of our texture. So let's go ahead and just turn this all the way to 0. This is really handy for textures that you really want the water to darken up the edges, especially like sand like we did in the previous video. But we're not going to cover all of these settings just yet. Like I said, I'm going to have a dedicated video specifically to the liquid stack. So right now we're just going to use our base details, and I'm only going to change the threshold, the blur amount, and the darken. We're going to leave everything else the way it is. And this albedo here doesn't change the color of our paint at all. It really just changes the color of the reflectance. But if we just set this to something like white, it'll be just fine for the purposes that we're trying to do. So how do we add that color back? Well, we'll just add another solid layer. This time we want that solid layer to be below the liquid layer. We're going to make sure it's from above, make sure it's wrapped to base, just like before. And now let's set it to a different color, something like, there we go, something like a yellow. And that's how we got another version of our painted block. So that is the run through of how I created this clean CMU texture utilizing a basic pattern method. In later episodes, I will take this texture and show you other methods of mixing things such as cracked block, vegetation growing out of the grout lines, blocks that are removed and you can see the rebar underneath, other texturing techniques like mold growing out, and so much more. Till then, I'll see you in the next one.